remember there were times when you were walking down the street and you saw somebody speaking to himself, you could easily establish that he was not quite min ha'yishuv. Today it's not any longer true. People speak to their cell phones. And we live in an age of technology that dictates the norms and the boundaries. It's a new world order. We're between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Classical question that's asked is, shouldn't we have kapora, atonement, first, and then go to din, to judgment? How well did you execute your kapora, and then be judged? Why do we have Yom Adin first? There are various approaches. One approach would seem that it's only through living through the reality of being Mamlech HaKadosh Baruch Hu, coronating the Rebbeinu Shalom, and establishing that distance, that proportion, that ratio between the Creator and His creations. Then there's a certain amount of honesty in our asking for the kapora from the Melech Malchei Amlochim, from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Prior to that, there's a lack of integrity in the dialogue, in the petitioning. But it also seems that there's a message. There's certain times in the year that lend themselves to certain realities. Dilshu Hashem b'imotzoi. This is a time that lends itself to tshuva. The phenomenon of tshuva is unto itself very fascinating. It would seem something is done. How do you undo that which was done? Or how do you do that which wasn't done when it was supposed to have been done? Medrash in Breishis says, Ator now is also tshuva. There's a certain nowness that the Rebbeinu Shalom, as it were, extends this opportunity to do revisionist history. Though we live in a linear world, there's past, there's present, and there will be a future. For the Rebbeinu Shalom, it's all simultaneous. But he lets us partake and connect to the simultaneity of Ator, Ein Ator el tshuva, now. Now I can rewrite my biography. It's a moment of transcendent truth. Some years ago, I was in London. I was there for a Shabbos or Sameach, JLE, Gold is Green. Came Shabbos, went to daven there, and the only person that had the key to the premises was the guard. Non-Jewish guard, they're very serious about security, and he didn't show up. 20 minutes, half hour, 45 minutes, 150 people milling in the streets. Having lived more than half my life in Israel, I tend to think like an Israeli at times. So I suggested it's chaval to have 150 people milling in the streets and not do something productive. Let's make a demonstration. But we couldn't agree about what to demonstrate. Finally, we got in. We were running about an hour late. And they asked me to give the guest drosha. I said the first order of business is that I would like to apologize for all those people who intended to come late and found out they came on time. But that's in fact our mission statement. Particularly Osamer, but generally Klal Yisrael, you may think you're late, but there's still time. It's time for tshuva. There's a moment to return, to put our house in order. Ad kidei kach, to the extent that it's possible to take earlier failures, turn them upside down, inside out, and turn them into virtues. Tshuva me'ava. That perhaps part of that is that I can empathize with somebody, a friend, a child, a Talmud that is going through a similar situation. So my earlier experience that I somehow overcame can now facilitate not just sympathy, but empathy, to be able to put myself in that place. Chazal teach that a mispalo bad chaveru, somebody davens for his friend, and he needs that. He gets answered first. So the Droshes Haran alludes to the fact that somehow we create spiritual cables when we daven, and when the response comes, it goes through the cables that we created, so it hits us first before it gets to its destination. But I believe it was the Alter Vorker Rebbe who said, read it carefully. He's davening for his friend. He feels that what his friend is lacking, he needs that because his friend is lacking, and he needs it because his friend needs it. He feels as if it's his lack. He so identifies and empathizes. That's a precondition for getting answered first. That degree of empathy. Many of us have heard the story of Rabbi Levine, is to talk about going to the doctor with his wife and said, our finger hurts. Anyway, somebody subsequently, after hearing this presentation, somebody came to complain with his wife that he was very thirsty, it was late at night, and his wife didn't bring him a drink. So she said, of course I felt he was thirsty, so I got up and took a drink. The Chafetz Chaim in yesterday's Parsha has a stunning, frightening, and inspiring presentation that the read of Jewish history is a graph where things go down, and because they go down, it's a kind of catapult effect that thrusts them further and then down again. And that ultimately the more challenges and difficulties and disappointments, frustrations, suffering are like a spring that is let open and shoots forward and projects an energy that will carry us to the ultimate Gula. Unlike other peoples that when they hit their lowest ebb, they invariably have been tossed into the dustbin of history. Klal Yisrael comes forward and marches even more. Haftorah yesterday. Yishon Dake Hashem. The ways of the Rebbeinu Shalom are just. That's why the video you saw, the learning can capture the imagination, the beauty, the wisdom of Torah. Even before someone sees it and understands its truth, he is overcome and overtaken by the power of the beauty and the wisdom, even if he's coming from the outside in. But that's what encourages him. So Yeshom Dake Hashem, says the Navi. For some people, it's tzadikim yelchu. It's meeting pious people. Meeting people who are consistent. Not like those philosophers who were caught doing ugly things, and they said, well, right now I'm not me. I'm somebody else. The Torah Jew says, you have to be you. And people recognize that. There was one student that flashed across there. There's a doctorate in linguistics from Cambridge. And somebody asked him, how did you handle the transition from Cambridge to Asameach? He said when he was taking his doctoral exams, it became so evidently clear that each doctoral student was making a presentation, shot down by the next one who said, you're pretty clever, but I'm smarter than you. And all of them finally by the instructor who said, you're all rather clever, but I'm even smarter than all of you combined. So when he came to the yeshiva, it was the first time in his life that he met people that were intellectually challenging, but they wanted to know the truth. They could say, I don't know. They could say, I'll have to ask. They could say, I'll have to look it up. Tzadikim yelchu bo. So there are various people that are more impacted by one, more by the other, but it's usually a combination, but the emphasis is on either the amazing consistency, penetration of the system as an intellectual system, conceptually. It's the people that live that way. Tzadikim yelchu bo. But there's a third possibility. The Navi says, "Upoishlim yikoshlu bo." The negligent will trip and stumble. I would submit that that's a third driving force that motivates a lot of people. Take a look at what the world looks like without Torah. Look at the decadence. Look at the slippery slide of how values, so-called values, have been totally obliterated. Each year, a new threshold has to be for more titillation in an artificially provocative environment, because yesterday's thrill is today boring. That's the universe in which we live. Paishim yakoshlu boy. Look at what the world looks like. But let's take it another step. Where's the consistency? Where's the justice? Jews are killed by Muslim fanatics. And nations of the world caution us, don't overreact. They say clearly who they are, what their goals are. Say, no, they just have to say that for their own communities and population. So they're lying to somebody, either them or us. And the nations of the world, We can cut deals, we can make contracts, agreements with known terrorists and murderers. The slippery slope actually began remember the frustration, disappointment, and the anger when the Nobel Peace Prize was given to Rabin, Peres, and Arafat. Shocking. Total bankruptcy of any moral considerations. I incurred the wrath of some of my liberal friends when I dropped a note to them saying I couldn't fathom how such an injustice could be possible on such a grand scale until I finally figured it out. That Arafat got the prize because he made peace between Peres and Rabin. Take a look at what the world looks like without Torah. Yesterday's values have become devalued. Rabbi Bechai says in this week's Parsha, there are two words, oyev, enemy, soneh, somebody who hates me. Frequently translated as enemy. He said there's a difference. Soneh is not as deep. It's more situational. Oyev is with greater depth of hate. Yishmael is oyev. Pirkei Rebbe Elazar says the final perek in the Messianic era in Ikvus of the Mashiach will be Yishmael. A lot of discussion, the Maharal, others, about the Alba Golios, and the climax will yet either be, like the Ramban says, a portion of that will be Yishmael, or like the Ibn Ezra, it is Yishmael, the climax. We're living through that today. But, like the Chafetz Chaim said, it's a spring. Every pain, every anguish, private and collective, has to catapult us forward with more energy. It's easier to say than to do. It's a medrash in Parshas Re'eh. Medrash asks, Yelamdeinu Rabbeinu, Mahu lo'odom shebiso, what is it? Is it acceptable, halachically, to add aliyas, make hafsakot in the reading of the Tochecha, of that portion of the Torah which tells us, which cautions us on what happens if we don't perform mitzvahs collectively as a nation. And remember, the Kuzari says that every one of us is part of a whole, a completeness, Klal Yisrael. And just like I can't say to my finger, when my finger gets cut, finger, it's your problem, it's my problem, so I can't say to any part of Klal Yisrael, it's your problem, it's not my problem. We're part of an integrated, total reality. Sometimes we see it, sometimes we don't, sometimes we feel it, sometimes we don't, but that's the reality. It's us, it's me, as Rav Blum said. And so, we have this chastisement in the Parsha. Twice it appears in the Torah. And in Parshas Re'eh, there's a halachic question which is posed, can you add aliyas, which means to make hafsakot, interruptions? Says the Medrash, no. Why? Because there's a pasuk, Rei anochi Noisen lefnechem, I'm giving you the bracha and the klal, and therefore you can't. What we call an enigmatic, esoteric, medrash, hard to understand what the relationship is between the question and the answer. Perhaps we might approach it like this. The Balaturim there says, Rei Anochi, look at the Anochi of Anochi Hashem Elokecha. Over there we're taught there was a miracle that they saw the sounds. Whatever that means, there was a miracle of seeing the sounds. Royim es hakailas. Of the many differences between hearing and seeing, hearing, you only hear one sound at a time. As I'll say, shtei kailas basachas lo nishmoin. If you hear A and B together, you're really hearing C, a new sound which is a merging of the two. Seeing, you see panoramically. There are two ways to relate to the tzoros of Klal Yisrael historically. The kiyum, the fulfillment of the teichacha. Either shmiyadik, as if it was audible merely, or riyadik, seeing it panoramically. Hearing it means hearing sequentially one event, another event, each one separate, discrete, nothing to do with the earlier events, each one in isolation. Then it's beyond our ken to handle it. But if we relate to these events panoramically, it begins with a bris ben absorim, a covenant, that pact that Avraham Avinu makes, that it's the lesser of the evils is Golos. And there's a Golos in Eretz Yisrael too. Right? We know that historically. We don't have a Beis Mikdash. We don't have Malchus Beis David. There's a Golos here. Relating to it, sequentially, take each event in isolation. How do we handle it? There's a Churban Bayis Rishon, a Churban Bayis Sheni. Expulsion from Spain, Chmielnicki, the Shoah, Yishmael, says Reb Chaim Vital, and says the Rambam in one of his Igros, they will inflict pain upon us that has never been experienced by Klal Yisrael anywhere else. Yishmael. We're living through that today. What's our koach? To become part of history, become part of the historic process. Riyadik, not to make hafsokas, don't interrupt. Don't relate to each event as a separate happening, but see the sweep. It does say, Asher Tishmu, because you have to feel the pain, the empathy. Relate to every Jew in history as my family, as me. But not succumb to it. It's all the difference in the world. I bow my head to the gvura, the heroism of the families that have experienced in our time such pain, such suffering, and continue forward, understanding that it's part of a process and that the ultimate triumph, as the Chofetz Chaim said, is because the deeper the pain, the greater the thrust forward will be towards Bias Agel B'mheira B'yameinu. The Ben Hashem should give a refuah shlema to our Talmud, Chaim Yechiel ben Malka, the Seich Shach Eli Yisrael, who's given a choma to all those bereaved families who have been so heroic in their marching forward in history with a sense of cautious optimism with an appreciation that they're playing a role in history, that the Ribono Shel Olam has chosen them, us, this period in time, for this particular shlichus. May the Ribono Shel Olam spare us any such trying challenges, and may we know only of slicha, mechila, kapora, al yedei simcha, not through yisurim v'chaloim roim. Gmar Simcha Tova.